In the second millennium BCE, the Achaeans saw an emergence of a Bronze Age civilization centered on the continental Greece and nearby islands. Modern historians call it Mycenaean Greece, after Mycenae, the most prominent city of the time. However, back in the Bronze Age, these early Greeks were known as the Achaeans. WanaxTV is a channel that walks you through the history of the Achaeans, from the early Greek Bronze Age settlements through their expansion, conflicts with the Minoan Crete, the Hittite Empire, the legendary Trojan War, and the great events of the heroic age, all the way through to the classical Greece, the Achaean League, and the wars against the Roman Republic. Please consider subscribing and sharing the video, as this is a one-person production and it greatly helps the visibility of the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. The Achaeans, also referred to as the Danaans after a legendary king, or Argives after an area that represented the center of their power, established their first major cities in continental Greece somewhere around 17th and 16th centuries BCE. Over the course of the Bronze Age, they would develop sort of a proto-confederated society with the most power centered around the city of Mycenae and its high kings, who would eventually come to dominate much of the continental Greece, the Aegean Sea, the island of Crete, the coastal areas of Asia Minor, and would come to be recognized as equals by one of the great powers of the age, the Hittite Empire. Now we will bring to light the social and political order of the Bronze Age Achaeans and analyze the hierarchy of their society, their economy and infrastructure, and their military organization, and the impact these things had on the Achaeans themselves and on their neighbors across the region. The Achaean society of the Bronze Age followed a very strict structure in which the class system consisted of the royalty, the aristocracy or landowners, the common people, and slaves. The royalty were residing in the palatial complexes known as the palace centers. Most of these cities were fortified by huge Cyclopean-style walls. Inside those palaces lived the royal families, the nobles, their servants, and the population that was usually employed for some work inside the palaces, such as artisans, craftsmen, and other professions. The ruler of the Achaeans was the Wanax, in later Greek known as Anax, the supreme political and military leader of the Mycenaean Society. Wanax or Anax was the ultimate judge in charge of making laws, determining taxes, declaring wars, and even religion. The same title was often used as an epithet for the gods themselves. For example, Zeus Anax signified his position as the king and the overlord of the gods. A state possessed by the Anax was called Temenos, which served as an official and even sacred domain owned by a king. This would signify that Anax had the divine right to rule, coming directly from the gods. The title's feminine form was Wanasa, the queen, who was chosen either from the Achaean nobility or the royal houses of the foreign powers in order to improve diplomatic relations or ensure alliances. Second in command was Lauagetas, the leader of the people. Lavagetas was the member of the royal family, most likely a prince that handled the matters in the name of the king or in king's absence. It is also possible that he was the crown prince, next in line for the throne. Like Wanax, Lavagetas had his own royal land, Temenos, although it was considerably smaller in size than that of the king. Lavagetas was also involved in religious affairs as well as military campaigns where he would command the army and engage in military operations. Next were the Equitae, who were the king's companions or his royal followers. These were various princes and members of the extended royal family that formed the top of the Achaean warrior society. The Equitae followed the Wanax in times of peace and war. They would occupy top positions in the social and political life of the palace, and they would also be the elite body of personnel during military campaigns. They typically drove chariots or consisted of cavalry units, unlike the foot soldiers that were of the lower class. After the Wanax and Lavagetas, the Equitae would share the main portion of the spoils of war, the slaves and other riches captured from the enemy. Then we have the Telestai. It is not very well documented where the Telestai fit into the Achaean hierarchy, but they certainly represented an important group of aristocrats. They were the major landowners who held possessions across the country on which the peasants and slaves worked. It is also likely that these aristocrats were able to occupy high religious positions and gain considerable influence within the Achaean society. Now we come to the Basileus. This title had significantly evolved over time, but originally meant a chieftain of a particular group of people. In one of the early tablets, this name was used as a reference to a chieftain of the bronzesmiths. It is unknown whether Basileus was originally a hereditary title or not, but it certainly was towards the end of the Bronze Age when it came to signify a local ruler or a minor king. An example of this would be the political situation during the time of the Trojan War, where the Wanax, who at the time was Agamemnon, gathered all the regional and local rulers called Basileus in his quest to attack Troy. In addition to these groups, there was also a council called Gerousia. It likely consisted of the powerful local elders and regional officials, but certainly did not have the powers that a later, more famous Gerousia of Sparta had. Either way, just like the title of Basileus, Gerousia of the Bronze Age would eventually evolve into one of the most important institutions. Outside of the palace centers, the territory largely consisted of the countryside and was divided into districts. For example, the territory of Pylos was divided into 16 districts, each headed by an official called Coretor. This Coretor, or Coretes, was a district governor that handled the affairs on a more local level. Like all other officials, he was appointed by the ruling class from the palace, usually by the king himself or sometimes by the Lavagetas. His deputy and second in charge was called procurator. These positions were reserved for aristocracy and were there to make sure that the things outside of the palace were running smoothly and with a strict oversight. Districts were then divided into smaller communities, which represented land held collectively by the damos or demos, literally meaning the people. The communal official in charge of each damos was called Damokolos. There was also a position called Dumatis, which meant a key bearer. Not much is known about this position, but it probably referred to a treasurer entrusted with keeping or handling the taxes that were collected from the local population. The common people were obviously underneath the aristocracy and consisted of the majority of the population. Depending on their standing and circumstances, they either lived on the countryside where they worked land or were in some cases employed in the palace centers. Those who worked and lived in the palace were skilled craftsmen and artisans. These people spent most of their time working inside the palace walls, producing things like armor, weapons, pottery, and other things including luxury items. They were supplied and administered by the palace officials who provided them with materials and commissioned these workers to create products that were needed for military, aristocracy, as well as for the common people. However, the overwhelming majority of the common people did not live in those palace centers. They lived in the various communities across the country, from the coastal areas to towns and more rural places higher up in the mountains. And as the society of the Bronze Age was heavily reliant on commerce and maritime trade, many of the higher standing people that lived along the coast were merchants, while others would typically be fishermen or even sailors. And while builders and other laborers were common in towns and urban areas, those living on the countryside and more rural parts were usually farmers or shepherds. Those people were still free, and they usually worked the communal land or were employed on some of the possessions held by the wealthy landowners. And this brings us to the lowest class, a slave or doulos. Slaves were usually working as laborers, typically for the palace or estate owned by an aristocrat. And they could also serve deities in a religious role where they would be called theoio doulos, which literally means slave of God, in which case their position was most likely significantly better and their life easier than that of the other slaves. Many of the slaves were brought as the spoils of war from the numerous Achaean campaigns throughout Greece, Anatolia, and Mediterranean, while some of them were victims of piracy and raids, which Bronze Age Achaeans were very well known for. And now we move on to the literacy of the Bronze Age Achaeans. Literacy was not something that was common in Bronze Age, and therefore only a select few of the palace officials were able to write. But it wasn't the Greek alphabet that these Achaean scribes were using for their records. In fact, the Greek alphabet would only be introduced centuries later, after the order of the Mycenaean Greece had long collapsed. It was the Linear B syllabic script, in which the earliest attested form of Greek was recorded on. Linear B was introduced in the 15th century BCE, and it was based on an even older script, the Linear A, which the Minoans of Crete have been using since the early 2nd millennium BCE. Linear B was likely used only by a limited number of professional scribes who served in the palatial centers, and therefore it was mostly the official and administrative records that were kept on them, such as evidence, distribution of goods, and other items. The Achaean society of the Bronze Age was at its peak from the 16th to 12th century BCE. Throughout this period, the Mycenaean Greece had become one of the main economic hubs of the Mediterranean. The economy of the Achaeans was based on the redistribution of goods, labor, and commodities in a structured system called the palace economy. In this type of the economy, production, collection, and then distribution were closely monitored and controlled by the administration of the palace. Each palatial center had its own storage where the surplus goods, materials, and items were stored and then redistributed according to its needs. The artisans and craftsmen had their workshops set up inside the palace centers as well, where they would be given raw materials from which different commodities were created, such as weapons, pottery, jewelry, and luxurious products for export, the most famously olive oil perfume. The Achaean palaces were known for their high level of organization, It was so well structured that they were able to assemble the labor force and resources and undertake large-scale projects in the fields of agriculture and infrastructure. The most well-known agricultural achievements of the Bronze Age Achaeans were the drainage system of the Kopais Lake in Boeotia, the construction of a large dam outside of the citadel of Tiryns, and the drainage of the legendary swamp of the Nemean Valley. The infrastructural projects included the construction of the large harbor of Pylos, as well as a number of harbors in other coastal cities. Achaeans were great shipbuilders, and their harbors were well suited for a variety of commercial as well as warships. But perhaps the most famous project was the construction of the Peloponnesian road network. This road network was very impressive, and it enabled fast transfer of troops between the palaces, many of which were fortified by the Cyclopean walls. These walls were built with massive limestone boulders, so big that it was thought that only Cyclopes were able to lift them. Accompanying agricultural economy and impressive infrastructure, trade with other Mediterranean centers, as we already mentioned, was essential for the Achaeans. They imported raw materials such as metals, glass, and ivory, and exported finished products made from those materials, in addition to their own local products such as olive oil, perfume, wine, wool, and pottery. The main commercial routes led to Levant, Assyria, Babylonia, and Egypt, with the most important intermediary station being the island of Cyprus, rich with copper and tin. On the other side, also an important commercial hub was the city of Troy, extending the trade routes to Bosphorus and the shores of the Black Sea. The Achaeans also traded with the Western Mediterranean, with commercial networks leading to Italy and even southern Iberian Peninsula. Trade, being essential for the Mycenaean Greece just as it had been for the Minoan Crete, ultimately was not the main activity the Achaeans were known for. It was war. The militaristic nature of their society was apparent in almost every aspect, from their art, in which the battle scenes were heavily represented, to numerous weapons which their leaders were buried with, and the preserved Linear B records they left behind. The Bronze Age Greeks invested heavily into development of military infrastructure and the logistics of war. According to the Linear B records, every damos, representing a small local community, was obliged to supply a certain amount of men to serve in the army. This was also the case with the aristocracy, who took great pride in being part of the military, where they usually assumed high-ranking positions. The army was mainly based on heavy infantry and chariots, much like the armies of other powers of the Bronze Age. It was also supported by archers, while limited cavalry also existed, consisting of horse-mounted warriors belonging to the class of equites. Initially, the infantry was equipped with large tower shields, long spears, limited or no body armor, and several different types of helmet, most famously the boar tusk helmet. In addition to the infantry, chariots were employed as heavy fighting vehicles. According to the Linear B tablets, most of the main palace centers were able to field several hundred of chariots of war. This was a very significant number for the Bronze Age, considering that the largest chariot battle in history, the Battle of Kadesh, fought between the Hittite Empire and the new Kingdom of Egypt, consisted of the grand total of about 5,000 to 6,000 chariots. An army that would not be so much bigger in size than if many of the palatial centers gathered and supplied their chariots for a common cause, for example a grand campaign against a common enemy. But back to the infantry, the swords were soon enough added to the offensive weaponry, and with the introduction of the heavy bronze body armor, tower shield became less frequent and gave way to the famous 8-figure shield. These battlefield tactics would later be modified towards the end of the Bronze Age, with light armor replacing the heavy one and lighter swords and spears gaining prominence in order to increase the mobility of the warriors. The famous 8-figure shield was also eventually replaced by an early version of a dipylon shield, which was considerably smaller and would later gain prominence in the archaic times. The chariots were also slightly modified, with some of them being used for transportation, likely reserved for the elite warriors and other highly ranked military personnel. This shift in tactics was most famously represented in Homer's Iliad, where a lot of the Achaean heroes of the Trojan War were transported by chariots to the field of battle, where they dismounted in order to continue fighting on foot. Although they were known as fierce warriors on the battlefield, the Achaeans maintained their sea supremacy through their navy. While being initially inferior to that of the Cretans, the Achaean ships soon outmatched all of their rivals, rising to completely dominate the Aegean Sea, conquering and colonizing Crete in the process. They were also protected with their geographic location and terrain from any possible land attack by a foreign power, and their supremacy at sea allowed them to constantly engage in wars, military campaigns, and even piracy without fear of being attacked themselves. Such warlike nature and strict hierarchy within a highly organized society had enabled Achaeans not just to enlarge their state at the expense of their neighbors, but to form sort of a sea empire that would dominate the Aegean for centuries. However, even the mighty Achaeans eventually saw their civilization crumbling. In the 12th century BCE, the Mycenaean Greece would see its society all but destroyed in a series of events known to history as the Bronze Age collapse. This was the first episode of the history of the Achaeans, giving an overview of their society, political system, economy, and military. In the next videos, we will talk about their early settlements, the rise of their early dynasties, expansion and domination of the Aegean Sea. Please subscribe to the channel and make sure to click the bell button in order to get notified of our future content. This was WanaxTV. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.